Can be seated. So before I begin, I just want to, first of all, I want to thank everybody for being here and wish all of you in advance Shana Tova. There were, unfortunately, a challenging year like the past means that you have to address many subjects. I will address the war in Israel on Yom Kippur. I've chosen today to address the other, in my opinion, issue of the past year, and that is Israel and the college campuses, but I will address the second issue on Yom Kippur. I just want to be clear, I have not forgotten about it. But each deserves its own treatment. And anything I say will not really cover all the ground. So here, a few thoughts on what's going on on our college campuses, even as we're speaking right now. So one of the enduring images of the high holidays is the following. We read this phrase. It's actually taken from the Mishneh tractate Rosh Hashana. It says that all humanity passes before God like a flock of sheep, is what we have in our Machzor Kivnei Maron. And it's a very beautiful image, imagining God as standing on a rocky outcropping, looking over verdant grass and grazing animals. It's a pastoral image that conveys peace and tranquility. But not to be picky here, but there is actually an alternative reading to that, and it was suggested by none other than the great Dr. Hanoch Albeck. So Albeck was one of the greatest Talmudic scholars of the 20th century, and he was for decades the chairman of the Talmud department at Hebrew University. And he believes the correct reading is not Kivnei Maron, but rather Kivno Meron, like a legion of an army, Latin. In other words, when we stand before God for judgment this day, if we accept this reading, we are arrayed like soldiers encamped in military tents, being reviewed, as it were, by the commanding officer. People encamped in tents. The image that captured the news cycle for weeks and months at a time. But these tents were not arrayed upon a field of battle. They were arrayed upon the quadrangles of the nation's elite universities. And the war was fought not with bullets, but with bullet points. It wasn't fought with IEDs. It was fought with ideas. It wasn't fought with mortars. It was fought with mortarboards. I don't mean to create a false equivalence, but nevertheless, this war also is one that we must be victorious. Well, the protesters claimed that many Jews also participated in these encampments. I have no statistics as to exactly how many. I've not seen any that I would regard as reliable, but I do know what my eyes saw. And here's what I saw: that there were a sufficient number of Jewish students involved in these encampments, at least at Columbia University, that they held a large Passover Seder. That I saw with my eyes. And seeing this, I knew that I wanted to speak to this image today. And in the spirit of Pesach that was held, I wanted to propose 4 questions. But I also want to recall in parallel that just prior to the horrors of October the 7th, Israel was convulsed with the largest protests in the country's history, larger than the protests after the first war in Lebanon, right? And that too raises questions, and those too need answers. And since Rosh Hashanah is, after all, about cheshbon hanefesh, about looking into our own souls too, and not simply looking at others, then I will propose 4 questions we ought to ask ourselves. So there you have it. 4 questions for them and 4 for us. First question I would like to ask the protesters: what is the end game of all these demonstrations? I'm no stranger to demonstrations, by the way. I often joke during my undergraduate years at Penn, my major was biological basic behavior and my minor was Soviet Jewry protest marches, I think. But that wasn't, although as significant as those marches were, and there were a lot of them, the largest were those for South African BDS. Those were the years, 1982 to 1985. Those were the years. I can still say the chants, right? Trustees, you know, South African stocks have got to go. I don't know where I put my coffee this morning, but I can say those chants. And if you had asked those protesters, what do you want if your efforts prove successful? They could have answered your question very easily. 1, free Nelson Mandela from more than a quarter century of incarceration, much of it in solitary confinement. 2, enfranchise Black South Africans to vote on a par with white South Africans. And 3 was a consequence of the first 2, that Nelson Mandela would become the Prime Minister of South Africa. It was hard, maybe impossible, to make a moral case against any of that. To the extent there was disagreement, it was about method. Should it have been engagement? Should it have been isolation? By the way, there is some research. It's outside my area of expertise, but I do think it sounds logical that those protesters were one reason, among others, that South African apartheid ended, just as it was one reason, among others, that we in the Soviet Jewry movement helped to get our brothers and sisters freed from behind the Soviet Iron Curtain. If you ask the protesters today the same question, expect an evasive answer. But here's the bottom line. If this were genuinely about occupation, that is the post-67 territories, then let the signage say as much. But genocide or from the river to the sea, let me turn that around for you. From the river to the sea, the state of Israel will be free. Free of what? Free of Palestinian terror? More likely, anyone who says that means free of Palestinians. And I wouldn't believe the person who told me otherwise. What is being called for, whether people know it or not, is the elimination of the state of Israel. And if students on college campuses were to call for the elimination of any of the more than 190 nations on earth, they would not be protected under the rubric of free speech. They'd be punished under the rubric of hate speech. I wonder how many students are aware of this utter hypocrisy. But the question for us is really the opposite. Look, calls for the elimination of the state of Israel are abhorrent. But we should always ask ourselves, are we genuinely living up to our image as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation? Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. And sometimes during the course of this war, I felt that the answer was no. I won't go into too many specifics. But when you're in a situation where your brothers and sisters are in captivity, and when you're fighting a war now first on one front and now on two, and where reservists are exhausted, every ounce of energy, every ounce of capital that you have has to be devoted to the efforts of the war. And too many times we saw crazy things going on, people going on the Temple Mount and for all kinds of reasons, and trying to reintroduce the very legislation during a war that divided the country in the first place, or harassing Palestinians in the West Bank, not a front in the war. I don't care what the rest of the world thinks, but I certainly care what I think. Second question. I'm curious if the protesters are fully cognizant of what Hamas believes, because not all, but quite a few, were displaying symbols of that very organization. of that organization. Not, I'm here to talk about Palestinian civilians unconnected to those events, but to that organization, but rather Hamas. The protesters, in fact, this one really caught my eye, it was called Gays for Hamas. Because Hamas, of course, has a great track record with the LGBTQ community. I see you agree. An Israeli satirist Riley observed the following: gays for Hamas is roughly the equivalent of chickens for Kentucky Fried Chicken. And by the way, that doesn't even cover the more usual and customary behavior of that organization in more general terms, which is sort of modeled on, I don't know, the KGB, East German Stasi, something like that. But the question for us, how do we really treat our non-Jewish minorities? And this story is worth repeating. There was one of the rescued hostages was a Muslim man. His name was Farhan Al-Qadi. And Al-Qadi was tarred and feathered by a rather right-wing news organization and, unsurprisingly, threatened because he ostensibly collaborated with Hamas. But actually, the opposite is true, it turns out. The opposite is true. Al-Qadi, the Times of Israel did some investigation, found out Al-Qadi was taken captive by Hamas because when they recognized him as fellow Muslim, tell me where we can find the Jews, and he wouldn't do it. And that's why they took him. And during his period of incarceration, he reached out and assisted another man. His name was Zalmanovich, a Jewish prisoner. And yet some in Israel found it impossible. How can a Muslim be empathetic to Jews? How can he act in an upright way? Why isn't it possible? Why do we have to assume the worst? Why can't we start with a fair assumption? Because if we want Israel to be what we think it should, we can't have these kind of prejudices clouding our judgment. The third question for the protesters: I wonder if they have knowledge of history. Unfortunately, it seems to me the faculty of any number of elite universities have disregarded the wise admonition of the late New York Senator Daniel Moynihan. Perhaps you've heard this. He once observed that you are free to have your own set of opinions, but you are not free to have your own set of facts. The child of a congregant of mine in New Orleans is a student. She was in her first year at Indiana University. By the way, Indiana University has a pretty good-sized Jewish population, whether you know or not, has a very well-respected Jewish studies department. It's called Bourne's. Quite a few rabbinical, cantorial graduate students are graduates or alumni of Bourne's. And she told me the following, that one of her professors claimed that there was no evidence of Jewish presence in the land of Israel in pre-modern times. Well, I wrote to the president of the university. I said, ma'am, there's about a century and a half of peer-reviewed research in academic journals which demonstrates the opposite. And in fact, the very week that this professor made the statement, there's no pre-modern Jewish presence in the land of Israel, a coin from the time of the Maccabees in Hebrew with Jewish symbols was discovered in Jerusalem by a kid. That's always who discovers things. Kids, that's because we got old eyes and they got young eyes. That's why they discover everything. And all I can say is, if the professor thinks the discovery isn't real, perhaps he spends his time pondering why the lunar landing isn't real either. Looked that way to me when I saw it. But the third question for us is, let's grant that signs about genocide are a sort of anti-Semitic gaslighting, but we would do well to remember that many innocent people in all wars lose lives. People in Gaza who are Palestinian and innocent of anything did lose lives, did lose family members. And you know why we have to make sure we minimize that? Because that is what Hamas wants. Do you know the larger the number of civilian casualties, the better it is for business as far as Hamas is concerned? You know what brings young, mostly men, into recruiting centers in Beirut and throughout the Arab world to go and sign up for Hamas? High death tolls of civilians. And if nothing else, the best reason to concern yourself with the death toll and to acknowledge the tragedy of death toll is because it is the opposite of what our enemies want, and we should never give them what they want, ever. And that leads me to my last question for the protesters. What exactly who would govern a Palestinian state? What would it look like? How would it conduct itself if such came to be? Well, obviously, if forced to choose, right, the Palestinian Authority is far preferable to Hamas. That's really not the question, of course. But the Palestinian Authority is itself a hot mess. It's filled with corruption, ineptitude. It reminds me of the signs I saw during my first stint in New Orleans in the early 90s. Right? When I came in 1991, one of the gubernatorial candidates was a man named David Duke. Remember him? Yeah, you do remember, okay, right? An avowed racist and one of the country's leading Holocaust deniers. He's still alive, by the way, I found out. So, of course, you had to vote the opposite. You voted for Edwin Edwards, okay? And you know what the bumper sticker said? They said, vote for the crook, it's important. That's what the bumper sticker they wrote around in Louisiana said. And I remember thinking, heaven knows, people deserve better than that. Well, so the Palestinians deserve better than that, really. And the same question, unfortunately, always applies to us. What's the kind of Israel we want? What's the character of the state of Israel? And here I want to go back to my own Penn undergraduate days about 40 years ago. And who appeared on campus? The late Rabbi Meir Kahane appeared on campus. Now, this was, of course, not allowed. It was against all the rules. How it happened, I do not know. I still have no idea. All I know is, like any other student, if an underground speaker shows up on a campus, you want to be there. For sure you want to be there. And be darned if I was going to miss it. And the place was crowded. So the late Rabbi Meir Kahane said two things, one which was shocking and not surprising, and one was shocking and pretty surprising. So the thing that was shocking but not surprising was this. He said, we kick out all the Palestinians, kick out all the Arabs. Okay? That was shocking to say that, but it's not surprising because he'd written a book with that thesis. The book is called They Must Go. You don't really have to read the rest. You can see what it's about. But the second was shocking and surprising. He said that democracy needed to end. Democracy in Israel needed to end. Why? Because after all, there's no democracy that one can discern looking at traditional Jewish sources. He's right on that particular score, right? The closest is, I don't know, Maimonides, the laws of kings and their wars. But that's not quite a democracy either. That's a shock, and that ought to be a surprise. Now, after 40 years of reflection, I can see that the two things are connected, right? Kicking out millions of Palestinians or Arabs isn't possible because you can't remove a population that large because the mechanisms of democracy will get in your way. The guardrails that we have in place in our governmental system won't allow you to just do anything you want. But if democracy were to end, it would be a logistical challenge. But I cannot necessarily claim it would be impossible. And I mention this because currently, right now, two ministers of Israel's current government self-identify as disciples, if you will, of the late Rabbi Meir Kahane. Now, I don't know if they made this explicit or not, but I heard the quiet part out loud. I heard it with my own ears. So my prayer is that we, of course, not allow this to happen. Just because our enemies falsely accuse us of apartheid does not mean we should fail to imagine that as a possibility. If we're not constantly vigilant, we can live down to the canards of our enemies, or we can live up to the standards of our founders. Returning to the passage I opened, I like to quote its continuation. And this is in the Proverbs. It says, Yotzer yachad libam mevina kol masayem. It says, God, as understood through the rabbinic prism, it means God can examine the deeds and thoughts of each individual Jewish person simultaneously. And yet, he creates our hearts as one. We will not reach a day of universal agreement. We're, after all, the people, you know, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, right? You've heard that one. But our hearts could be, can be, must be united toward a single goal: to support an Israel which we are committed to both protecting and perfecting, to defend us against slander and promote splendor. In a word, to move us away from a world of armies and encampments and toward a world of sheep and shepherds. Shana Tova.